firm believer that literally every person you have ever met in your life, and likely you yourself, at one point in time has considered themselves to be an expert on parenting. Even those, you know what, no, scratch that, especially those who've never had kids of their own. Right, we've all been that person at least once in our lives. You're on a plane or a bus or some sort of a crowded place of some kind, and you hear a baby start crying, and the baby just keeps crying, and you find yourself thinking, man, can't they get that baby to stop? Like there's some sort of magic button you can press, and it'll stop crying. Or you've maybe been at a restaurant, and maybe a table next to you or a couple tables down from you has got a toddler or small child sitting in it, and that kid is just making a giant mess. They've got more food in their hair than they do in their mouth. And you sit there and you think, man, can't they control that kid? Why don't they stop him from doing that? Or, my personal favorite, you're at the store and you happen to be near the toy section and you hear a child just losing their minds because their parent won't buy them a certain toy. And you find yourself wondering, what's the big deal? It's a toy. Just get it so the kid will shut up. Right? We've all been that person, have we not? Am I the only one? Please don't let me be the only one. Okay, cool. Good, I'm not. But then you have a kid of your own. And all of a sudden, everything makes a lot of sense to you. Everything that you've thought, you realize you don't know anything at all about anything. It's a fun experience to have. You suddenly realize that the kid who's crying on the plane or the bus or wherever you are, maybe the parents are trying to do everything they can to get the kid to stop because they know that it's upsetting the people around them, but they just can't get that kid to stop crying for one reason or another. You realize that because now it's your kid that's doing that. Or you're at the restaurant and you begin to understand why the parents don't care the kid is making a huge mess because they're just happy he's eating anything that's not dinosaur-shaped or high in sugar. Or maybe they're just excited about the fact that they're eating out in public like a regular person because you don't understand how much of your life gets taken over by somebody who can't even pull themselves to sit up. Or you're in the store and your kid starts throwing the tantrum over the toy that they don't have, but you know that they've got 1,000 other toys at home, maybe toys just like it, or maybe you don't have it in the budget to buy that toy right now because you're spending too much on diapers and formula and all the other stuff that you have to spend your money on, and the suppliers know that you have to spend your money on, so they're just going to keep jacking the price up because you're going to pay for it anyway. There is nothing in the world that can truly prepare you for becoming a parent until you actually become a parent. And this is all common stuff that's normal and average to everyone. But there are always going to be those things that you cannot prepare for just your kid. Every kid presents their own trials and their own struggles and their own issues, and you don't realize it until you're facing it. This week, rather than coming up with a story of my own, because you guys hear my stories all the time, and you're probably tired of them by now. I'm a little tired of them. But this week I decided to ask some of my friends on Facebook who are parents, and just ask them to give me some idea of what was something that they weren't expecting when they had a child, but that they've had to deal with as a parent. Some of the responses I got were really funny, really funny. Some of them were moving, like I found myself tearing up at one. Some of them were just downright sad, even upsetting. But it shows a truth that there is a story behind each one of them. The truth of the matter is, no matter how well planned you think you might be, nothing can really prepare you to become a parent. You're not prepared for the day when you're changing your kid's diaper and your child decides that wall next to the changing table needs to be a different shade of brown. You're not prepared for how brilliant your kid might be in some areas and how terrifyingly they're not brilliant in others. How terrifyingly dumb they can be in some spots. You're not prepared for things like that. One told me that they weren't expecting to see their own stubbornness reflected in their child until all of a sudden it was there. One shared that she wasn't expecting her kids to be easier as toddlers than they are as adults now. I'm sure there's a story behind that one. One said that they weren't expecting their kids to grow up quite as fast as they did. They knew it would be fast. They knew that time would go quickly, but they weren't expecting it to be that fast. And now they find themselves wishing for just a little bit more time. One said she had no idea how much love she would have for her 3 kids. She said she knew that she would love them, but she went on to describe it as her heart walking around in 3 different bodies. One of my guy friends told me that he didn't know how crazy childbirth and even the post-baby time would be for his wife, so he wished he would have known it so he could have been better supportive of her in that time. I really hope his wife saw that one. I really do. One father who lost his wife very unexpectedly said that he never expected to be parenting alone. A couple of my friends shared they weren't expecting on raising kids who had different health issues. Along the lines of needing open heart surgery, one had juvenile arthritis, and one had diabetes. And the struggle that would be for them. And one parent even shared with me that they weren't expecting to live past their children. There is nothing in the world that can truly prepare you to become that parent. Each child has its own struggles, its own successes, its own problems, and a whole other host of other things that we just don't know about until we're in the middle of. We can read books, we can clip articles, we can do everything that we can, but we still aren't prepared for those struggles, and we still face some of those problems and struggles well after our children have grown and move out. A parent's job doesn't stop just because the kid has grown up. We're still that parent for them. Having children of your own can really help you understand and even appreciate some of the struggles that your own parents had when they were raising you. It begins to shed a new light on what's going on. Not everyone has parents that really invest in them or even, dare I say, care for them. And it creates a whole other host of problems. But by and large, I choose to believe that most every parent in the world is doing exactly what I'm trying to do as a father. And that's my best. I'm not perfect. There are times when I'm far too impatient with my children than I should be. But like all of you who are parents in this room, I'm doing my best. I'm trying real hard. I can't speak for everyone here. But I know that there are things that I said and did as a child to my parents that now as a parent I wish I could take back. There are things that I said, actions that I took, rebellions that I had that I really wish I could go back and stop myself from doing. Because you don't understand how much that hurts until you're on the other side of it. There are also things that my parents said and did that at the time made absolutely no sense in the world to me. Things that I didn't understand. Why would they say that? Why are they trying to stop me from doing this? And now as a parent, I totally get it. Because I've had those moments, and you've probably had them too, where as a kid you said, when I grow up and I have kids of my own, I'm never going to say. And then when you had kids, you said it. The first time I ever drove with the girls and I had to tell them that they needed to behave or we were going to turn around and go home, I found myself wondering, when did Scott Bogue get in the car? It's that face and that realization of knowing this is exactly why my dad would say that to me. Because it's understanding that, hey, you know what? Maybe I was being too loud and he was getting distracted and maybe he was worried we'd get into an accident. Or maybe he just had a headache because I've been loud all day. But parents are responsible for us. When you become a parent, all of a sudden, whether you've become a parent natural means or through adoption or any other ways that you can become a parent, you all of a sudden are met with the realization that you are now responsible for providing for, feeding, clothing, and taking care of an entire human being. I don't know about you, that is a daunting realization. I got scared. Of course, my kids were really small. The first time I held Adrian, when Adrian was born, she was 4 pounds, 11 ounces because twins are always smaller than, I was going to say regular babies, but they are regular babies. But the first time I held Adrian, I found myself saying, nope, I'm going to break this. She's too light. We have that realization that all of a sudden we are responsible for a whole human being. We have to take care of them. We have to make sure that they learn and grow and develop into a fully functioning member of society. That is the goal as a parent. You set rules, you set parameters with them for the sole purpose of making sure that they stay safe. And then when they rebel against those rules, when they do things that disappoint you, when they disobey you, whether privately trying to hide it from you or right to your face, it hurts. Because you know that they don't understand that that rule is only there to protect them, so it hurts you. Just like it hurt your parents when you did it. It's a harsh realization to have. But understand that it mattered to God. It matters to God that parents would be given a role that is a place of respect and a place of honor. That it's a position that we're not supposed to go into lightly. In fact, it mattered so much to God that he went so far as to command us. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, he said, honor your father and mother so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Now keep something in mind here. We talked about this, way back in week 1. We've maybe briefly mentioned it in the weeks that have passed since then. But when God is giving out these 10 commandments, he's doing so to the entire nation of Israel. It's one of the only times in Scripture where God addresses an entire nation of people. They're all outside this mountain. They hear this big booming voice telling them all this stuff. Had to be a little bit scary too, right? And so as God is going through this list of rules, and he finally gets to this one and telling, honor your father and your mother, I don't know about you, but I can picture in my mind, there's at least one dad in that crowd of people who just ever so slightly nudges his kid. Did you pay attention to that one? Because I can see my dad doing that. Matter of fact, if I'm really honest, I could probably see me doing that. Anyway, but this was something that was so important to God that as he had the people of Israel in front of him, he felt the need to put this not just as one of his declarations, but as one of his 10 commandments. God made a list of laws that were only 10 laws long. So you got to think that of all the rules that you and I could possibly think of, God must have thought these 10 had to be really important. And so it's unusual that we might find honor your father and your mother in the midst of this list. But this command is not just a simple notion of listen to your parents, do what they say. It's more than that. It's not the command that God gave here. God's command is that we honor our parents. To not just obey, that's obviously implied by that, but to give them honor, to hold them into high esteem, to give them our respect, to care for our parents when they can no longer care for us, to continue to hold them into high esteem even after our parents are gone. It's not a command meant just for children, but for every person who has a parent, which last time I checked, y'all came from somewhere. It's not a command that simply goes away when we turn 18 or we move out of the house or we graduate college or we go off on our own. It's a command that lasts throughout our lifetimes. To honor our father and mother even when they're well past being with us. In fact, this is the only one of the 10 commandments that God gives a caveat to, something that will be good if you follow this one. When he says in verse 20, he says that we may have a long life. Honoring your father and mother is something that is commanded by God to the point that he offers us a long life with us. This is a command that Absalom probably should have paid more attention to. You may not be overly familiar with the story of Absalom, but it's in 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 18 is where we're going to end up today. Maybe go ahead and turn there in your Bibles, open up your app to it, whatever you want to do there, or just listen, that's fine too. We're going to be kind of going through those 3 different chapters there to tell the life of Absalom. But again, this is a story you're probably not overly familiar with, because this is one of the stories of the life of David we really don't like to talk much about. Right? When we hear about David, we think of certain stories that come to mind. We think about his struggle against Saul. We think about Bathsheba. Most everybody in the world, even whether they go to church or not, probably knows the story of David and Goliath. I mean, because we've been referencing, we're in the middle of March Madness, right? So we've probably heard the phrase David and Goliath at least 16 times. Can I just say, this is time out here. I'm so happy Kentucky lost. It filled me with joy. My friend Beef, Cody, who came here and preached for us one time, he's a huge Kentucky fan. He didn't talk to me the whole next day. It was fantastic. But we're used to these stories of David, so when I say the story of Absalom, maybe this is a story that we're not overly familiar with. But again, we find it in 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 18, so go ahead, get there in your Bibles, whatever. As you're doing so, let me give you a little background as to who Absalom is. At this point, David is still king of Israel, and he is a beloved king. Everybody loves David. Everything that he has done, he is leading Israel to a new wave of prosperity that they'd not ever seen, a wave that was going to continue on through to the next king of Israel. David is beloved in the nation of Israel, but as good a king as he is, David sometimes struggles as a dad. See, David's kids, and he had a lot of kids, they weren't exactly the best kids in the world. One day, one of his children, in fact his firstborn, Amnon, I don't know what he was thinking in this particular moment, but he chose to commit the heinous crime of raping his half-sister Tamar, the full sister of Absalom. Absalom knew that eventually David had learned about this particular crime, that David had known that his son had committed this terrible, terrible sin. And so Absalom waited for his father, Amnon's father, the king, to do something about it. But as time passed, at least in Absalom's viewpoint, David wasn't going to do anything. Amnon was still alive. Amnon still seemed to be the heir apparent to the crown. And after waiting so long for his father to discipline his child, for his king to give justice for his sister, Absalom decided he would take matters into his own hands. Now, we might view this sort of thing as heroic. We might view him as justified in this action, right? I mean, this is a heinous crime that's been committed to his sister, and he just wants simply to give justice to her. But understand, it's not his place. It's not his place to discipline his brother. It's his father's place to do that. It's not his place to give justice to his sister. It's the king's place to do that. Absalom invites his brother over as he has a giant feast to shear his sheep. Apparently when you shear sheep, you're supposed to eat a big meal afterwards. I didn't know that, so next time you're shearing your sheep at home, invite me over. We'll have pizza. But Absalom invites Amnon over to his house. They're having a great time. Amnon is drinking, he's eating, he's just having a good old time. And right as the whole festivities reach their peak, Absalom gives his men a signal, and they brutally kill Amnon, stabbing him repeatedly in front of everyone to the point that people are fleeing the scene. Absalom went out for justice. And again, it's something that we understand, right? I mean, his sister had been defiled, taken advantage of. All he was trying to do was give her justice. But again, and we cannot miss this point, it was not Absalom's place to give his sister justice, to discipline his brother. That belonged to his father, the king. So in the eyes of David, in the eyes of the nation of Israel, and probably even to Absalom himself, he was now a criminal. And he did what criminals do. He ran. He fled to the nation of Jeshurun. After about 3 years of living there, David is persuaded by Joab, one of his advisors, one of Absalom's close friends. He's persuaded by him to allow Absalom to return to Jerusalem without any form of punishment. David was inclined to give Absalom no punishment here because, again, at the point of it all, while he is king, he's also a father. And after not seeing his son for 3 years, his quest for justice was no longer important to him. He just wanted to have his boy home. So Absalom, after 3 years in exile, after 3 years of running away, after 3 years of looking over his shoulder, is allowed to return home to Jerusalem, to go back to his father. And we might think that this would be something that would endear David in Absalom's heart forever. Absalom deserved the justice that David would give him. He deserved the punishment for the crime that he committed. So in the fact that David is letting him go scot-free, you would think that maybe that act of mercy would be something that Absalom would cherish, that he would love his father forever. But that's not the way the story goes. I don't know if it was because he thought his father was a pushover here. I don't know if maybe he was still harboring resentment over his father's perceived inactivity in disciplining Amnon. But when he's finally back in Jerusalem, Absalom comes up with a plan. We see his plan in 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 2 through 4. We read this. He being Absalom, would get up early, stand beside the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone had a grievance to bring before the king for settlement, Absalom came out to him and asked, "What city are you from?" If he replied, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel," Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are good and right, but the king does not have anyone to listen to you." He would add, "If only someone would appoint me judge. Then anyone who had a grievance or dispute could come to me, and I would make sure he would receive justice." Understand, it was a fairly common practice in this particular time period that if you had a dispute, for instance, if you and your neighbor just could not get along, if there was some point of disagreement, something that you guys just couldn't stand each other on, maybe you didn't like the way he trimmed his hedges, maybe he didn't like the way that you were out partying until 3 in the morning and then revving up your diesel engine. Probably not that one. But if you guys could not come to a resolution yourself for this conflict that you faced, it was fairly common practice that you would go and bring this conflict before the king. Because whatever the king would proclaim is exactly how things are going to be. He's the king. And so as people would come into the nation of Israel, they would get close to, or as they would come to Jerusalem, they would get close to the city gates of Jerusalem and they would see Absalom standing there. And Absalom would ask them what the dispute was, what's going on, what's causing the problem here. And then I love this part. Absalom would always say, "You know what, you're in the right here." Because who doesn't want to hear that when they're in the middle of a conflict? I haven't heard it much in my marriage, but I love it when I get to hear, "You're right." It's fantastic. We want to hear that we're right in the midst of that conflict and to hear the son of the king tell him, "You're right." But the king just doesn't have time. The king doesn't have anybody who can listen to your complaint. The king can't settle this for you. If only somebody would make me judge. This combination of, lying to people and telling them the king didn't have time, but also saying, "I would give you justice," began to make Absalom a very popular guy amongst the people of Israel. And all of a sudden it began to sour some people's opinions on David. If David doesn't have time to help his people, what is he doing? What's he doing with all that time? Why are we paying taxes to him? Why are we allowing him to remain king? When this guy Absalom clearly actually cares about me. And over the course of time, Absalom began to get really popular amongst the people. After 4 years of doing this, can you think about that for 4 years? Every single day. This is what Absalom did for 4 years. Absalom decided that his plan was ready for phase 2. Absalom went to his father, went to David and asked if it was okay for him to go to Hebron so that he could, as verse 7 puts it, fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. Now, Hebron is a place that maybe you hear that name and there's a little bell in the back of your head that rings because it's a fairly popular place in Scripture. It's something of great importance all the way back to Abraham. But just in the life of David, Hebron carries with it a lot of huge significance. See, when David was made the king of Israel, Jerusalem was currently under foreign rule. It had been taken over by others. And so when David was crowned king of Israel, David was crowned in Hebron. So the town of Hebron has huge significance in the history of Israel and in David's own personal history. It's an important spot. David, of course, is going to let his son go and worship wherever it is he feels is necessary. So he tells Absalom, go ahead, go to Hebron, go worship, go fulfill your vow. And as Absalom leaves, he tells his friends, tells his men, go out into the town, go out into Jerusalem, and proclaim, Absalom is being crowned king in Hebron. This is a deception that might actually work, right? Because David was crowned in Hebron, so why wouldn't Absalom be crowned there? Absalom is not only deceiving the people, he's not only deceiving his father, but now he's trying to take his whole country out from underneath him. It's one thing when you and I rebel against our parents. He's rebelling in a way that's trying to take a whole country. Can you imagine rebelling in such a way that an entire country turns on your dad? No. But that's exactly what Absalom's doing. He's trying to take the crown that does not belong to him out from his father. This inevitably leads to civil war. Because while there are still several in Israel who are loyal to David, who remember all the things that he did for them, who remember what a great king he truly is, and aren't swayed by Absalom's deception, there are a lot of folks who believe Absalom should be king. And so war breaks out amongst the nation of Israel itself. Brother turns against brother. Son turns against father. It is a dark chapter in Israel's history. It is a dark chapter in David's life. David is so threatened by Absalom and his popularity that David has to flee. There are battles that take place throughout this entire time period. Bloody, bloody battles. All because one son chose to rebel against his father. But even though his kid has done all this stuff, even though Absalom has continued to rebel against his dad over and over, time after time, even though Absalom has tried to take his very crown, at the heart of it all, Absalom is still David's son. And so when the war begins to shift into David's favor, and it looks like David might just win this whole thing, and his men are trying to come up with a plan to assassinate Absalom to finally get rid of the snake himself, David says this in 2 Samuel 18, verse 5. He says, treat the young man Absalom gently for my sake. Even though Absalom has rebelled against his father, caused a huge civil war that is leaving the nation of Israel in turmoil, David doesn't want him to die. He still has that belief that there can be some sort of a restitution, some sort of a resolution to their relationship. Somehow they can still mend this fence. They can still have that relationship as father and son. So please, treat my son gently for my sake. Again, as the battle has turned in David's favor, Absalom and his men begin to flee. And Absalom's riding a mule, which is an unusual choice in this particular instance, but that's what he chose. And as he is fleeing while riding on this mule, the mule goes underneath an oak tree. And Absalom has very long hair. And so the mule keeps running past the oak tree, but Absalom doesn't. His hair gets tangled up in the midst of this tree. He's dangling there on his hair alone, which to us, kind of funny, right? Picturing a dude flailing there, can't get his hair out of the oak tree. When David's men come upon this scene and they see Absalom hanging there in this embarrassing, downright disgraceful place for a leader of a potential nation to be hanging in, they see an opportunity. See, they understand that David doesn't want Absalom to die. They understand that David wants to spare his son. But they know that if Absalom lives, this war may continue. He may try again. He may do something to try to steal his father's crown. And so while Absalom hangs there in a tree, they kill him. They end his very life. Far too early. Understand, Absalom's death was so very avoidable. It was something that could have been avoided altogether. It wasn't his place to pronounce judgment on his brother. He didn't know what his father was going to do about it. He simply had to trust that maybe his dad would take care of the situation. It wasn't his place to do this sort of thing. He acted impulsively. Then when his father showed him tremendous mercy, allowing the son that he loved to come home, rather than that renewing his loyalty to his dad, Absalom tried to take his nation away, take his crown from him. And all that rebellion against his father ever got him was an embarrassing and humiliating way to die. See, when God gave the command, honor your father and your mother, he likely knew, he's God, so he likely knew that there would be times when that would be a bit of a stretch for us. See, I can't speak for you. Again, I can only speak for me, but there were a lot of times growing up, if I'm really honest, there are a lot of times now when I think I just know more than my parents. When I think I know better. When their ways seem outdated and my way seems like it's the best. Each one of us have wrestled with that throughout our lives. I don't think any one of us in here can stand on this stage and honestly proclaim, I never once disobeyed my parents. It's something that we all wrestle with in some way, shape, or form. But we are still told to honor them, to respect them, to listen to them, no matter what age we are. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why? Why is this so important to God? Why is it so important to God that we honor our parents that he decided to put it in the top 10? Why does this matter? I think the reason is actually fairly simple. See, when we're born, our parents become the primary authority figure in our lives. Right? It's their responsibility to make sure that we follow the rules. So they become the authority figure to us. They are our first authority figure. And how well we are able to obey or honor or listen to them is likely a direct reflection on how well we'll be able to obey and listen and honor God. Our parents are our first authority. God is the ultimate authority. And so if we cannot follow our parents or honor our parents in the way that we should, there's a very good chance we're not going to be able to honor God the way that we should. There is a direct correlation between the two. I don't think there's a coincidence that God would tell us to honor our father and mother and then refer to himself as our heavenly Father. The ways that you and I honor our parents and their earthly authorities has a direct correlation to how well we honor our Heavenly Father. Keeping that in mind, parents, it is so incredibly important that we model the same love, the same grace, and the same mercy as God has given us. We cannot, in any way, shape, or form, abuse our God-given authority over our children to the point that we become a burden to them. That is not our role as parents. There is a fine line between being that authority figure and being a burden. We have to find out where that line is. Because if we venture off into the area of becoming a burden, if we venture into that arena where we become a burden to our children, it'll likely have an effect on their relationship with God. You and I know stories of people who struggle with faith, who wrestle with the idea of God as an authority figure in their lives. And they may say it's because I don't agree with His rules, I don't agree with the commandments of God, I don't agree with the Bible. But I can attest that most of the time it's because they were not shown the same grace, the same forgiveness, the same love that God has given each and every one of us. Some of you in this room, some of you watching us online today, you know this sort of thing firsthand because you grew up with parents who weren't worthy of the honor that you were called to give them because of the way they mistreated you, because of the way they abused you, or even because of the ways they had nothing to do with you. Most of the time, people who have a misguided viewpoint on who God is likely had parents who did not set the example that they were meant to. This is not something that we who are or will become parents should ever treat lightly. This is not a role that we should ever take flippantly or to ever treat as anything less than what it is. The Apostle Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. He said, "Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord." Now, we like to stop right there. Don't we, parents? Children, obey your parents, for this pleases the Lord. But he keeps going on in verse 21 and says, fathers. We could probably go ahead and substitute the word parents. Do not exasperate your children so that they won't become discouraged. Yes, as children, we should obey our parents. We should live to honor them, to reflect our respect of them, both publicly and privately, whether they are still alive or not. We should still find ways to honor our parents as much as we can. But parents, we need to be worthy of that honor ourselves. To treat it with the respect that it has. There is so much significance to this particular commandment that we cannot overlook. As children, no matter what age, we should honor our parents. As parents, we should be worthy of that honor. The two are intertwined together. Even after everything he had done, even after all the ways that Absalom proved himself to be unworthy of his father's love, even after rebelling against his father time after time after time, even costing thousands of Israelites their lives, when David heard of his son's fate, when he heard that Absalom had been killed and that there was no one to contest his crown, that the nation of Israel was his once again, David did not celebrate. In fact, we see exactly how David reacted to the news of Absalom's death in 2 Samuel 18, verse 33. He says, "The king was deeply moved, went up to the chamber above the city gate and wept. As he walked, he cried, 'My son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son.'" even though Absalom had rebelled against his father, even though he had led the nation of Israel into a civil war. In spite of all of that, David still wished that he could have died in his son's place. That is the love of a father. That even though Absalom was unworthy of it, David still loved his son. That is also the heart of our God. That even though you and I are unworthy of it, even though time after time we have proven to him how unworthy of it we are, he would still send his son in our place to die. To die the death that we deserve because of our own rebellion. He would die instead of us. That is the love of our Father.